John Randolph had always found solace in the simplicity of farm life. After retiring as a firefighter due to an on-duty injury, he moved to the countryside to manage the family farm he inherited from his late uncle. The farm was more than just a piece of land, it was a second chance, a sanctuary where he could rebuild his life, far from the chaos of his old profession. The rolling fields, dotted with wildflowers and fruit trees, brought him peace he hadn't felt in years. Here he cultivated rare herbs and organic vegetables, selling them to local markets and slowly restoring the neglected land. The mornings on the farm were his favorite, cool and quiet, with the sunrise painting the sky in soft hues of orange and pink. But one morning the tranquility was shattered by the low rumble of heavy machinery. It was distant at first, but as John made his way to the edge of his property, the sound grew louder, accompanied by the rhythmic thud of falling trees. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the source of the noise, a line of bulldozers pushing through the woods, flattening everything in their path. John's heart raced as he crossed the field to the construction site. His land, untouched for decades, was now a scene of destruction. Trees lay toppled like matchsticks, their roots clawing at the sky. A group of workers in neon vests stood near the equipment, talking casually as though they weren't demolishing someone's home and livelihood. Beyond them, a tall banner fluttered in the morning breeze, its bold letters announcing the development of a new suburban neighborhood, Green Hills Estate, -15 premium homes available soon. "What the hell is going on here?" John shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. The workers turned to look at him, their expressions ranging from confusion to indifference. A foreman, wearing a hard hat and holding a clipboard, stepped forward. "Can I help you, sir?" the man asked, his tone more bored than concerned. "This is my land," John exclaimed, gesturing to the wreckage. "What are you doing here? Who gave you permission to build?" The foreman raised an eyebrow and flipped through the papers on his clipboard. "According to the records, this property is part of the Green Hills Development Project. All permits and contracts are in place. If you have an issue, take it up with the developers." John's blood boiled. "There's been a mistake," he said firmly. "I didn't sell this land. I own it, and I never agreed to any development." The foreman shrugged. "That's not my problem, buddy. We're just here to do our job." He turned back to his crew and barked an order, and the machines roared back to life. Stunned and furious, John stormed back to his farmhouse. His mind raced as he tried to process what he'd just seen. He had spent years pouring his heart into this land, restoring it to its former glory. And now, without warning, someone was tearing it apart. When he reached the house, he noticed a stack of mail on the kitchen table. Amid the usual junk and bills was a thick envelope with an official seal. Opening it, John's stomach churned as he read the contents. The letter claimed that his property had been repurposed for residential development under a local zoning initiative. Attached was a document bearing what was supposed to be his signature, authorizing the sale of a portion of his land. John's hands shook as he examined the paper. The signature was a forgery. It was close, but not quite right. He knew he hadn't signed anything. Panic and anger surged through him in equal measure. How could something like this happen? Who would have the audacity to forge his signature and sell his land? He grabbed his phone and called the number listed for the development company. After several minutes of being transferred between departments, he finally reached someone who identified themselves as a project manager. But the conversation only made things worse. "Sir, all transactions related to Green Hills have been processed legally," the man said, his tone clipped. "If you're disputing the sale, you'll need to take it up with your local zoning office. But as far as we're concerned, everything is in order." John's voice shook with rage. "This is my land. I didn't sell it, and I didn't authorize anyone to use it. You can't just come in and destroy my property." "I understand your frustration," the manager replied, though he didn't sound sympathetic at all. "But we're not responsible for how the sale was handled. Our job is to develop the property. If there's an issue, it's out of our hands." The line went dead. John set the phone down and leaned against the kitchen counter, his breathing heavy. He couldn't believe this was happening. His land, his home, was being stolen right out from under him. And if he didn't act quickly, there might be nothing left to save. He paced the kitchen, thinking about his next move. He needed answers. He needed proof. Digging through the filing cabinet in his study, John pulled out every document related to the farm deeds, tax records, zoning maps. If someone had tampered with his property rights, he was going to find out. As he pored over the papers, he couldn't shake the image of the bulldozers tearing through his fields. This wasn't just about land. This was about his life, his legacy. Whatever it took, John was determined to stop the destruction. But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning of a much bigger fight. The following morning, John woke up with a knot in his stomach. The memory of the bulldozers tearing through his land and the indifference of the foreman lingered like a bad dream. He made himself a cup of coffee, but the bitter liquid did nothing to calm his nerves. Today he had to figure out what had gone so wrong. Someone had sold a portion of his land without his knowledge or consent, and he wasn't going to let it go without a fight. John started by calling the county zoning office. He explained his situation to a receptionist, who transferred him to a clerk in the property division. After waiting on hold for what felt like an eternity, a monotone voice finally came on the line. "This is the zoning department. How can I help you?" John gripped the phone tightly, trying to keep his voice steady. "This is John Randolph. I own a farm on County Road 12, and yesterday I discovered that part of my land has been turned into a construction site. I received a letter claiming the property was repurposed for a development project, but I never signed off on anything. I need to know what's going on." The clerk hesitated for a moment. "Let me pull up the records for that address." There was a long pause, punctuated by the sound of keyboard clicks. Finally, the clerk spoke again. "It looks like the land was rezoned and sold as part of the Green Hills residential development project. The transfer was finalized about 6 weeks ago." "That's impossible," John said, his voice rising. "I didn't sell my land. I didn't authorize any rezoning. This has to be a mistake." "Well," the clerk replied, sounding unimpressed, "we have a signed authorization form on file. It's dated and notarized. If you're saying you didn't sign it, you'll need to file a formal dispute. You can do that by coming into the office and filling out a property rights contention form." John clenched his jaw. "I'll be there today," he said before hanging up. He spent the next hour gathering every document he could find: his original deed, tax receipts, even an old zoning map that showed his land as agricultural. He stuffed everything into a folder and drove to the zoning office, his mind racing. How could this happen? Who would forge his signature, and why? The zoning office was a sterile, fluorescent-lit building that smelled faintly of stale coffee and paper. John approached the front desk, where a young man barely looked up from his computer. "I need to file a property rights contention form," John said. The clerk slid a clipboard across the counter without a word. John filled out the form as quickly as he could, detailing his claim that the land transfer was fraudulent. When he handed it back, the clerk flipped through it briefly and nodded. "All right," the clerk said. "We'll forward this to the review board. Someone will contact you within 30 business days." 30 business days, John's voice echoed in the quiet office. "By that time, the developers will have bulldozed my entire property." The clerk shrugged. "That's the process." Furious, John left the office and called the development company again, demanding to speak with someone in charge. After being transferred repeatedly, he was finally connected to a man who identified himself as the project coordinator. "I need to know who authorized the sale of my land," John demanded. "The signature on the documents is a forgery, and I've already filed a dispute with the zoning office." The coordinator sighed. "Look, Mr. Randolph, I understand you're upset, but we have all the necessary paperwork. If the zoning office approved the sale, then we're within our rights to proceed with construction." "You're building on stolen land," John snapped, "and I'm not going to let you get away with it." The coordinator's tone hardened. "If you have a legal issue, I suggest you take it up with the zoning office or your attorney. But as far as we're concerned, this project is moving forward." The line went dead. John stared at his phone, seething with frustration. He couldn't believe how little anyone seemed to care. His land, his home, was being ripped away from him, and no one was willing to help. Determined not to give up, John decided to consult a lawyer. He remembered an old acquaintance, Julia Park, who specialized in property law. He called her office and explained the situation, and she agreed to meet with him that afternoon. Julia was sharp and no-nonsense, with a reputation for taking on powerful developers and winning. When John laid out his documents in her office, she examined them carefully, her brow furrowed. "This is definitely suspicious," she said. "The signature on this authorization form doesn't match the one on your original deed, and the zoning change was pushed through unusually fast. It's almost as if someone wanted to avoid scrutiny." John nodded grimly. "That's what I've been trying to say. What can we do?" Julia leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen against the desk. "First, we need to get an injunction to halt the construction. That will give us time to investigate the sale and gather evidence. We'll also need to request a formal audit of the zoning process. If there's fraud involved, we can take legal action against both the developers and the county." John felt a glimmer of hope for the first time since this nightmare began. "How long will it take to stop the construction?" Julia hesitated. "That depends. Judges don't always grant injunctions right away, especially if the developers claim they're working within the law, but we'll make a strong case. In the meantime, I recommend documenting everything. Take photos of the construction, keep records of any communication, and be prepared for pushback." "Pushback?" John asked. "Developers don't like being challenged," Julia said. "They might try to intimidate you, especially if they're hiding something. Be careful." Her words sent a chill down John's spine, but he nodded. "I'll do whatever it takes." As John drove home, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a long and difficult battle. The developers were powerful, and the county seemed complicit in their actions. But John wasn't going to let them win. This farm was his life, his legacy, and he was prepared to fight for it, no matter the cost. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, John stood at the edge of his property, staring at the construction site. The bulldozers were still there, silent and menacing in the fading light. He could see the foundations of several houses already taking shape, their skeletal frames a stark reminder of what was at stake. The developers might have the law, or at least their version of it, on their side, but John had something they didn't: determination. This land had been in his family for generations, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, John made a silent vow. He would fight with everything he had, and he wouldn't stop until justice was served. The following days were a blur of activity for John, his initial shock giving way to determination as he threw himself into the fight to save his land. True to Julia's advice, he began documenting everything. With a camera slung over his shoulder, he walked the perimeter of the construction site, photographing the damage to his property and the rapid progress being made on the foundations of the houses. Each day, more machinery arrived, and the skeletal outlines of additional homes began to take shape. The workers largely ignored him, though some glanced at him with thinly veiled amusement, as though they knew he was fighting a losing battle. One afternoon, as John was taking pictures of a pile of uprooted trees, he noticed an oily sheen on a patch of grass near the edge of the site. The stench of chemicals hung heavy in the air, and the soil was discolored, seeping with a viscous black substance. His stomach sank. This wasn't just a construction site, it was turning into an environmental disaster. He knelt down to get a closer look, careful not to touch the contaminated ground, and took several photos. Whatever was leaking into the soil, it wasn't natural, and it wasn't safe. Back at the farmhouse, John immediately called Julia to report what he'd seen. "It sounds like they're either dumping waste or rupturing something underground," she said. "If that's the case, we have another angle to stop them. I'll contact an environmental inspector to assess the site." The next day, an inspector arrived, a tall man with a weathered face and a clipboard. He introduced himself as Alan Drake from the county's environmental agency. John led him to the area where he had seen the contamination, and Alan's expression grew grim as he surveyed the scene. "This is bad," he muttered, crouching to take samples of the soil. "Whatever they've dumped here, it's leaching into the ground. If it gets into the water table, it could poison the entire area." Alan spent hours examining the site, taking photographs and jotting down notes. By the time he finished, his initial politeness had given way to visible frustration. "They're cutting corners, plain and simple," he said. "I'll file my report, but I can tell you right now that this is a violation of multiple regulations. If they don't address it, they could be facing serious fines or worse." For the first time, John felt a flicker of hope. If the environmental damage was severe enough, it might force the developers to halt construction. But that hope was short-lived. The following morning, as John was preparing to head back to the site, he noticed something unusual. A heavy-duty chain and padlock had been attached to the makeshift gate leading into the construction area. A new sign had been posted: "Authorized personnel only. Trespassers will be prosecuted." Undeterred, John stood outside the gate, his camera in hand, taking pictures through the gaps in the chain-link fence. Several workers glanced in his direction, and one of them, a burly man in a hard hat, walked over. "You've got no business here," the man barked, crossing his arms. "You're not allowed on this site." John squared his shoulders. "This is my land. You have no right to be here, and I have every right to document what's happening." The man smirked. "Your land? Buddy, that's not what the paperwork says. Now I'm telling you nicely, leave before I call the cops." John felt his blood boil but knew better than to escalate the situation. "Go ahead and call them," he said, turning to leave. "I'll be waiting right here." The man didn't call the police, but the confrontation left John rattled. It was becoming increasingly clear that the developers were trying to intimidate him into backing off. Still, he refused to be cowed. That evening, Julia called with an update. "Alan's report is damning," she said. "The contamination is worse than we thought. He's filed a formal complaint, and the agency is issuing a stop work order for the site." "That's great news," John said, relief washing over him. "Does that mean they'll have to halt construction?" "Technically, yes," Julia replied. "But don't celebrate just yet. Developers like this have a habit of ignoring orders if they think they can get away with it. Keep an eye on the site and document everything. If they keep working, we'll have even more evidence against them." As Julia predicted, the developers didn't slow down. The day after the stop work order was issued, John saw bulldozers back in action, leveling the remaining parts of his property. Furious, he called the environmental agency to report the violation, but their response was frustratingly slow. "We'll investigate," they assured him, but by the time an investigator arrived, significant progress had already been made on several new foundations. Feeling the pressure mounting, John decided to rally his neighbors. Many of them had lived in the area for decades and were just as opposed to the development as he was. At a hastily organized meeting in his barn, John laid out the situation, showing them photos of the contamination and the ongoing construction. "This isn't just about my land," he said. "If they get away with this, they'll do the same thing to the rest of the area. We have to stand together." The response was mixed. Some neighbors, like Mary and Tom Jensen, were supportive and agreed to sign a petition demanding the immediate cessation of construction, but others, like Paul Greaves, were less enthusiastic. Paul, a gruff man in his 60s, folded his arms and leaned back in his chair. "Look, I get that you're upset, John," he said, "but some of us don't want to make waves. These developers have deep pockets, and I don't want them coming after me." "They're already coming after all of us," John shot back. "Do you think they'll stop with my farm? They'll keep expanding until this entire area is covered in concrete and strip malls." Paul shook his head. "I'm sorry, but I've got my own family to think about. I can't afford to get involved." The meeting ended with a mix of hope and frustration. While some neighbors were willing to fight alongside him, others remained on the sidelines, either out of fear or apathy. Still, John was determined to press on. That night, as he reviewed the day's photos, he heard a loud crash outside. Grabbing a flashlight, he stepped onto the porch and saw that someone had smashed the wooden fence surrounding his property. Near the broken planks, a spray-painted message glared back at him: "Stop fighting or else." John's hands tightened into fists. He knew this was meant to scare him, to force him into submission. But if the developers thought he would back down, they were wrong. They had taken his land, polluted his soil, and now they were trying to intimidate him into silence. This was personal now, and John was ready to fight with everything he had. John woke up to the sound of rain pattering against the windows. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil inside him as he stared at the growing pile of documents, reports, and photographs scattered across his kitchen table. His fight against the developers had become all-consuming, leaving him little time for anything else. Yet, every step forward seemed to come with a new setback. The developers were relentless, the authorities slow to act, and the neighbors divided. Over the past few days, the situation on the construction site had only escalated. Despite the stop work order issued by the environmental agency, the developers continued their work under the cover of night. John had taken to walking the perimeter of his land with a flashlight, documenting the illegal activity whenever he could catch it. The frames of several more houses were already standing, their skeletal outlines stark against the dark sky. The land he had spent years nurturing was being mutilated right before his eyes. Julia had been doing everything in her power to push the legal case forward. The forged signature, the contamination, and the blatant disregard for regulations were all strong pieces of evidence, but progress was slow. The developers had a well-funded legal team that was skilled at dragging out the process. Every time Julia filed a motion, they responded with delays, counterclaims, and bureaucratic red tape. Adding to the tension was the growing divide among the neighbors. Some, like Mary and Tom Jensen, had become staunch allies, helping John collect signatures for the petition and spreading awareness about the environmental damage. But others, like Paul Greaves, had begun openly siding with the developers. Paul's sudden change of heart was suspicious, to say the least. He had gone from being cautious to outright hostile, accusing John of stirring up trouble and jeopardizing the neighborhood's future. "Why are you so determined to stop this project?" John Paul had said during their last encounter. "These homes will bring money into the area. You're just being selfish." Selfish, John had retorted, barely able to contain his anger. "They're poisoning the land, Paul. This isn't just about me, it's about all of us. Or are you too blind to see that?" Paul had walked away without another word, but the confrontation left a bitter taste in John's mouth. He couldn't shake the feeling that Paul was more involved with the developers than he let on. One evening, as John sat at the kitchen table going through old records, he came across something that stopped him cold. It was an envelope tucked away in the back of a filing cabinet, marked with his late uncle's handwriting. Inside was a stack of documents related to the farm's history. Among them was a deed from decades ago, outlining the original boundaries of the property and a series of handwritten notes about the land's unique ecological features. One line in particular caught John's eye. Area contains rare wetland species protected under state conservation law. His pulse quickened as he read the words again. If the land was classified as a protected area, the developers might not have had the legal right to touch it in the first place. He immediately called Julia to share the discovery. "This could be huge," Julia said, her voice brimming with urgency. "If we can prove that the land is protected status, it could override the zoning changes and invalidate the sale entirely. But we'll need an expert to confirm it." The next morning, Julia arranged for an environmental specialist to visit the site. Dr. Ellen Warner was a no-nonsense biologist with decades of experience in conservation. She arrived armed with maps, testing equipment, and an air of quiet authority. John led her to the most damaged areas of the property, where the wetlands had been partially drained to make way for foundations. Dr. Warner examined the soil, collected water samples, and took photographs of the construction. She even pointed out a few plants that she identified as endangered species. "This land should never have been touched," she said after several hours of work. "The developers either didn't know or didn't care about its protected status. Either way, they're in serious violation of state and federal law." John felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in weeks. "What happens now?" he asked. "I'll compile my findings into a report," Dr. Warner replied. "If the courts accept it, the developers could be forced to halt all activity and restore the wetlands. But don't expect them to go down without a fight. They'll try to discredit me, delay the process, and muddy the waters any way they can." Sure enough, the developers wasted no time retaliating. Within days of Dr. Warner's report being filed, they launched a public relations campaign to sway local opinion. Glossy flyers appeared in mailboxes across the neighborhood, touting the benefits of the Green Hills development. The flyers promised new jobs, increased property values, and a state-of-the-art community center. At the same time, anonymous letters began circulating, accusing John of being a troublemaker and anti-progress. One even claimed that he was responsible for the contamination on his land, alleging that he had used illegal pesticides that leaked into the water supply. John was furious but not surprised. He knew the developers would stoop to any level to protect their profits. What he didn't expect was the sudden escalation of threats. Late one night, he was jolted awake by the sound of breaking glass. Rushing to the living room, he found a brick lying on the floor amid a pile of shattered window shards. Attached to the brick was a note scrawled in black marker, "Back off or else." Shaken but resolute, John called the police. When the officers arrived, they took his statement but offered little reassurance. "We'll look into it," one of them said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "In the meantime, maybe you should think about de-escalating the situation." De-escalating wasn't an option. Not when his land, his home, and his legacy were at stake. John spent the next day reinforcing the property, installing motion sensor lights, and setting up makeshift barriers around vulnerable areas. He also reached out to his neighbors, rallying those who still supported him. Mary Jensen organized a community meeting at her house, inviting as many people as she could. About a dozen neighbors showed up, and John laid out the latest developments. He shared Dr. Warner's findings and urged everyone to stand together against the developers. "This isn't just my fight," he said, his voice firm. "If we let them get away with this, they'll keep pushing until there's nothing left of this community. We have to draw the line here." The room buzzed with murmurs of agreement, but the tension was palpable. Everyone knew the stakes were high, and not everyone was willing to take the risk. As the meeting ended, John noticed Paul lingering by the door, his expression unreadable. "Something you want to say?" John asked. Paul hesitated before finally speaking. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, John. Maybe you should just let it go." "Let it go," John repeated, incredulous. "This is my land, Paul. My family's land. I'm not just going to roll over and let them destroy it." Paul shook his head and walked out without another word. John watched him go, the unease in his gut growing stronger. That night, as John prepared for bed, his phone buzzed with a text from Julia. "The developers just filed a motion to dismiss the case. They're claiming the wetlands designation is invalid. We need to act fast." John stared at the screen, his resolve hardening. The developers were escalating their tactics, but so was he. This wasn't just a fight for his land anymore. It was a battle for justice, for accountability, and for the future of the place he called home. The following days were relentless. The developers had shifted into overdrive, escalating their tactics to an entirely new level. Despite the environmental reports and the mounting legal challenges, construction on the site showed no signs of slowing. Workers operated machinery late into the night, and new structures were rising at an alarming pace. John couldn't help but feel that they were trying to finish as much as possible before the courts could intervene. Julia, as always, worked tirelessly to push their case forward. The motion to dismiss filed by the developers had thrown a wrench into their plans, forcing her to divert resources to counter their arguments. "They're trying to overwhelm us," she explained during a tense phone call. "If they can bog us down with legal maneuvers, they might be able to finish the project before we can stop them. But we're not backing down." For John, the stress was becoming unbearable. His days were spent monitoring the site, documenting violations, and organizing the neighbors who still supported him. At night, he barely slept, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. The constant harassment wasn't helping either. The broken fence and threatening notes had been just the beginning. Now anonymous phone calls interrupted his evenings, and unfamiliar cars idled outside his farmhouse late at night. One evening, as he was cleaning up after dinner, John heard a commotion outside. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch, his heart pounding. The sound of voices carried through the darkness, followed by the unmistakable clang of metal. He followed the noise to the far side of his property, where he found a group of men unloading barrels from a truck and rolling them toward the wetlands. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" John shouted, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. The men froze for a moment before one of them stepped forward. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a smug expression that made John's blood boil. "Just doing some cleanup," the man said casually. "You should mind your own business." "This is my business," John shot back. "You're on my property, and I'm calling the police." The man's smirk faded, replaced by a cold glare. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he said. "Might not end well for you." John didn't flinch. "Get off my land. Now." For a tense moment, neither of them moved. Then the man signaled to his crew, and they began loading the barrels back onto the truck. As they drove off, John managed to snap a few photos of the vehicle's license plate and the barrels, hoping it would be enough to prove they were up to something illegal. The next morning, John forwarded the photos to Julia and the environmental agency. Alan Drake, the inspector, promised to investigate. "This kind of activity is highly suspicious," he said. "If they're dumping hazardous materials, it's a serious crime. But we'll need hard evidence to act on it." John felt a surge of frustration. It always seemed like the burden of proof was on him. While the developers operated with impunity, he was tired of playing defense. Later that day, he called a meeting with his neighbors, determined to rally more support. To his surprise, the turnout was larger than he expected. Even some of the more skeptical residents had shown up, likely spurred by the growing rumors of contamination and harassment. John stood in front of the group, holding up the photos of the barrels. "This is what we're up against," he said. "They're not just building houses, they're destroying this land. If we don't stop them now, there won't be anything left to save." The crowd murmured in agreement, but not everyone was convinced. Paul Greaves, who had been growing increasingly antagonistic, crossed his arms and raised his voice. "You're blowing this way out of proportion," Paul said. "You're making enemies out of people who are just trying to do their jobs. Maybe it's time to let this go, John." John's jaw tightened. "Let it go." "They're breaking the law, Paul. They've forged documents, poisoned the soil, and now they're dumping God knows what into the wetlands. And you want me to just sit back and watch?" Paul shrugged. "Maybe they made some mistakes, but this development is going to bring money and opportunities to the area. We should be working with them, not against them." "Working with them," John snapped. "You mean letting them buy you off like they've already done with you?" The crowd gasped, and Paul's face turned red. "Watch your mouth, Randolph," he growled. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know enough," John shot back. "And so does everyone else here. You've been defending them from the start, Paul. Maybe you'd like to tell us why." Paul didn't respond. Instead, he stormed out of the meeting, slamming the door behind him. The tension in the room was palpable, but John took it as a small victory. The more Paul revealed his true colors, the more people seemed to rally behind John's cause. That night, John received a call from Julia. "The developers have filed another motion," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "They're claiming that the wetlands designation is invalid because the area was reclassified during the rezoning process. It's a blatant lie, but it's going to take time to fight." "How much time?" John asked. "Too much," Julia admitted. "If they keep pushing like this, we might not be able to stop them before they finish construction." John's chest tightened. He couldn't let that happen. The developers were betting on his exhaustion, hoping he would give up or run out of resources. But if they thought he was backing down, they didn't know him at all. Determined to turn the tide, John reached out to Alan again, pressing him to escalate the investigation into the dumping incident. He also contacted a local conservation group, hoping to draw more attention to the environmental damage. The group's leader, a passionate activist named Claire, agreed to visit the site and help organize a protest. Within days, signs began appearing in the neighborhood "Protect Our Land" and "Stop the Green Hills" disaster. Neighbors who had been hesitant to take a stand now joined the cause, their anger fueled by the growing evidence of corruption and contamination. The protest culminated in a tense standoff at the construction site. Dozens of residents gathered outside the gates, chanting and holding signs. The developers had called in private security, and the atmosphere was electric with confrontation. John stood at the front of the crowd, his resolve unshaken despite the intimidation tactics. "We're not going anywhere," he told the security guards. "Not until you stop destroying this land." The guards said nothing, but their presence was a clear warning. As the protest continued, John couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to escalate even further. The developers weren't going to back down without a fight, and neither was he. The day of the court hearing arrived with an air of tension so thick that John could feel it in his chest. The protest outside the gates had grown in the past week, drawing attention from local news outlets and sparking heated debates throughout the community. Yet, despite the growing public support, John knew this day was critical. The outcome of the hearing could determine whether the developers would be forced to stop construction or if they would push forward, crushing everything in their path. Julia met John outside the courthouse, her expression calm but determined. "We've got a strong case," she said, clutching a thick binder of evidence. "The forged signature, the environmental violations, the wetlands designation, it's all here. But be prepared. Their lawyers are going to come out swinging." Inside, the courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as the hearing began. On one side sat the developers, their lead attorney a sharp-dressed man with an air of arrogance. On the other sat John and Julia, flanked by a few of the neighbors who had come to show their support. Among them were Mary and Tom Jensen, whose unwavering loyalty had been a source of strength for John throughout the ordeal. The developer's attorney wasted no time launching his attack. He argued that the sale of the land had been conducted legally and that the forged signature was an unsubstantiated claim. He dismissed the environmental concerns as exaggerations and suggested that John was using the wetlands designation as a desperate ploy to halt progress. When it was Julia's turn, she methodically dismantled their arguments. She presented the original deed with John's legitimate signature, comparing it side by side with the forged authorization form. She called Dr. Ellen Warner to the stand, and the biologist gave a detailed account of the environmental damage, emphasizing the presence of endangered species and the contamination of the wetlands. "This land is not just property," Dr. Warner concluded, her voice firm. "It is a critical ecological zone that should never have been tampered with. The developers knowingly violated multiple regulations, and their actions have caused irreparable harm." The developer's attorney attempted to discredit her testimony, but Julia countered every point with precision. She presented photographs, soil tests, and even the truck license plate numbers John had captured during the dumping incident. The evidence painted a damning picture of negligence and corruption. As the hearing stretched into the afternoon, John felt a flicker of hope. The judge, a stern but fair woman, appeared to be listening intently to Julia's arguments. She asked pointed questions about the rezoning process and the developer's rapid push to build. For the first time, it seemed like the truth was cutting through the noise. But then came the unexpected twist. During a break, Julia leaned in close to John, her voice low. "They've called Paul Greaves as a witness." John's stomach sank. Paul had been a thorn in his side for weeks, openly siding with the developers and undermining his efforts to rally the neighbors. Whatever testimony Paul was about to give, John knew it wouldn't be in his favor. When Paul took the stand, he avoided meeting John's gaze. Under questioning from the developer's attorney, he painted John as a troublemaker who was stirring up unnecessary conflict in the community. He downplayed the environmental concerns and suggested that the development was ultimately a good thing for the area. "They're offering opportunities that this town desperately needs," Paul said, his voice steady. "It's time to stop fighting and move forward." Julia's cross-examination, however, revealed cracks in Paul's story. Through careful questioning, she uncovered that Paul had recently received a significant payout from the developers under the guise of a consulting fee. The revelation sent a ripple of murmurs through the courtroom, and Paul's credibility was left in tatters. With Paul's testimony discredited, the focus shifted back to the evidence. Julia delivered a powerful closing argument, highlighting the developers' blatant disregard for the law and the community. "This is not just a fight for one man's land," she said. "It is a fight for accountability, for justice, and for the protection of resources that belong to all of us." The judge announced that she would take the case under advisement and issue a ruling in the coming days. As the courtroom emptied, John felt a mix of relief and lingering anxiety. They had done everything they could, but now the outcome was out of their hands. The following week was agonizing. Construction on the site had slowed but not stopped entirely, and the developers continued to push their narrative through glossy advertisements and PR campaigns. John spent his days working on the farm trying to distract himself, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. Then, one afternoon, Julia called with the news. "We won," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "The judge ruled in our favor. The developers are ordered to cease all construction immediately, restore the wetlands, and pay damages for the contamination." John sank into a chair, overwhelmed by a rush of emotions. Relief, vindication, and gratitude washed over him all at once. But Julia's tone turned serious. "This isn't over yet," she warned. "They'll likely appeal, and the restoration process is going to take time. But for now, this is a huge victory." That evening, John stood at the edge of his property, staring out at the construction site. The machines were silent, the skeletal frames of the unfinished houses standing like ghosts against the setting sun. He felt a deep sense of pride, not just for himself, but for the community that had come together to fight alongside him. This was his land, his legacy, and for now it was safe. But he knew the battle had only shifted, not ended. As long as developers like these existed, willing to cut corners and trample over people's lives, the fight would go on. And John was ready. The silence on the construction site felt almost surreal. For weeks the air had been filled with the roar of bulldozers and the shouts of workers. Now it was quiet, the half-finished structures standing as empty monuments to a battle won. John stood at the edge of his property, the judge's decision still sinking in. The developers had been ordered to cease construction, restore the damaged wetlands, and compensate him for the harm they'd caused. It was a victory, but John knew the scars of the fight would take time to heal. In the days following the ruling, the developers made good on their promise to appeal, but their momentum had been broken. The court's decision was strong, bolstered by Julia's airtight case and the damning evidence they'd uncovered. For the first time since the ordeal began, John felt like he could breathe again. Yet, there was still so much to do. Restoring the wetlands would be a massive undertaking. Dr. Warner returned to the site with a team of conservationists to assess the damage and develop a plan. Standing together at the edge of the polluted marsh, she explained the steps involved removing the contaminated soil, reintroducing native plant species, and monitoring the water quality to ensure the wetlands could recover. "This is going to take years," she said, her voice tinged with both determination and caution. "But it's possible. With the right resources, this land can heal." John nodded. He wasn't afraid of the hard work. The fight to save his land had taught him the value of persistence, and he was ready to see it through to the end. The community, too, was beginning to recover. The neighbors who had stood by John's side during the fight were more united than ever. At a gathering hosted by Mary and Tom Jensen, they talked about forming a local council to protect their area from future threats. The scars left by the developers had made it clear how vulnerable they all were, but it had also shown them the strength they had when they stood together. Even Paul Greaves, who had so openly sided with the developers, seemed to have had a change of heart. He showed up at the gathering, looking sheepish and contrite. "I was wrong," he admitted quietly to John. "They dangled money in front of me, and I took it. I thought it wouldn't matter, but it did. I'm sorry." John regarded him for a moment, then nodded. "What matters is that you're here now. We've got to move forward." The work of rebuilding wasn't limited to the land. John found himself reconnecting with the reasons he had come to the farm in the first place. He began planting a new crop of herbs and vegetables, pouring his energy into the soil and watching it slowly come back to life. Each seed he sowed felt like a small act of defiance, a way to reclaim what the developers had tried to take from him. The settlement money helped cover the costs of restoration, but John didn't use it all for himself. He donated a portion to the conservation group that had supported him, ensuring they could continue their work in protecting other vulnerable areas. The rest he invested back into the farm, upgrading his irrigation system and repairing the damage caused by the construction. As the weeks turned into months, signs of progress began to emerge. The wetlands, once a barren and polluted wasteland, were starting to show signs of life. Small green shoots poked through the soil, and the air grew fresher as the contamination was cleared away. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. One evening, as John stood on his porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Julia called. "I just got word from the appellate court," she said. "They denied the developer's appeal. The ruling stands." John felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The threat was finally over. That weekend, the neighbors gathered on John's farm for a celebration. It was a modest affair: homemade food, laughter, and a sense of camaraderie that hadn't existed before the fight. Standing before the group, John raised a glass. "This isn't just a victory for me," he said. "It's a victory for all of us. For the land, for our community, and for what's right. Thank you for standing with me. I couldn't have done it without you." The crowd erupted in cheers, and for the first time in months, John felt at peace. The road ahead would still be difficult, but he wasn't alone. The fight had forged bonds that would last long after the developers had packed up and left. As the night wore on, John found himself walking to the edge of the restored wetlands. The stars reflected off the water, and the sounds of frogs and crickets filled the air. He smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. The land was healing, and so was he.